The sound came through the heavy oak of the council chamber door, a muffled wave that broke against the stone corridor and washed over Sarah where she stood. She held a silver tray, delicate and cool beneath her fingertips, bearing 2 porcelain cups of steaming Keshian tea. Its spiced, earthy scent, which had always felt like a small, private comfort shared between them, now seemed cloying, an accomplice to the sound that had just reached her. It was Damon's laugh. Not his true laugh, the one that rumbled deep in his chest when she told a clumsy joke or when the sun caught the garden in a particularly beautiful way. This was different. This was the laugh he used with his men, sharp, dismissive, a tool to forge camaraderie at another's expense. Her feet had stopped of their own accord. She had been on her way to him, a quiet offering in the middle of a long day of tedious statecraft. It was a ritual she cherished, a small anchor in the swirling currents of his duties. She would bring him tea, he would lean back in his chair, and for 5 minutes, he would not be the High Lord of the Northern Reaches. He would just be Damon, her Damon, his eyes softening as they met hers. But then came the words, carried on the tail of that brittle laughter. Lord Valerus, his voice thick with wine, had said something she couldn't quite catch, something about the endless demands of the court. And Damon's reply, clear as a bell through the wood, sliced through the air and into her heart. You know nothing of demands, Valerus. You are not married to a woman who believes your every waking moment is a gift she is owed. Another round of chuckles, coarser this time. Gods, she's exhausting. The dawns, the walks, the constant needing. A man needs space to breathe, to simply be. Exhausting. The word hung in the air, a poisoned dart. She felt it strike, a sharp, cold sting that spread through her veins, chilling her from the inside out. The tray in her hands trembled, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor. The tea sloshed against the rim of the cups, the dark liquid a mirror to the stain spreading across her soul. Needing. He said it like it was an accusation, a crime. All her small gestures of love, the threads she had so carefully woven to bind their lives together, the shared sunrises, the hand she sought in the dark, the questions about the burdens she longed to help him carry, he saw them not as threads of connection, but as chains. The laughter inside the room faded, replaced by the low murmur of political talk. The moment had passed for them. For her, it had just begun. She stood frozen in the corridor, the scent of the tea now a nauseating reminder of her foolishness. She had thought these were shared moments. She had believed she was offering solace, a quiet harbor. Instead, she had been a relentless tide, wearing him down. Slowly, with a precision that felt alien to her trembling body, she turned. Each step back down the corridor was a deliberate act of will. The stone floor was unforgiving beneath her soft slippers, each footfall a silent admission of defeat. She didn't return to the kitchens. She walked to their chambers, the vast, opulent rooms that had always felt like a sanctuary. Now, they felt like a cage she had unknowingly decorated. She placed the tray on a low table by the window. The steam had ceased its dance. The tea was getting cold. She looked at her reflection in the polished silver surface, a woman with flushed cheeks and eyes that were suddenly, terrifyingly clear. She saw the hopeful girl she had been, the woman who believed love was an act of constant, gentle offering. And in that moment, she watched that woman die. A quiet, bloodless death, leaving behind something new. Something harder, cooler. Something that would never be called exhausting again. That night, she did not wait for him. She performed her evening rituals with a calm, detached efficiency. She bathed, brushed her hair until it shone like spun moonlight, and slipped into her side of the vast, cold bed. When he finally came, smelling of wine and parchment and the weary weight of his power, she feigned sleep. She felt the dip of the mattress as he lay down, the familiar warmth of his body near hers. For a moment, her treacherous heart yearned to turn, to press herself against his back, to seek the comfort that had always been there. But the memory of his words, his laugh, was a wall of ice between them. She lay perfectly still, her breathing even and slow, a masterful performance of peace she did not feel. He sighed, a sound of profound fatigue, and sleep claimed him. For Sarah, sleep was a distant country she could no longer find her way to. She stared into the darkness, and for the first time in their marriage, she felt utterly, completely alone. The next morning, The sun rose, as it always did, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. But for the first time since they had wed, Sarah was not there to see it with him. She did not wake him with a gentle touch and a whispered invitation to the balcony. When Damon awoke, the space beside him was empty and cool. He blinked, a faint sense of dislocation settling over him. He found her in the dining hall, already seated, a book open beside her plate. "Good morning, my lord," she said, her voice a perfect crystalline chime. It was polite, impeccable, and utterly devoid of the warmth he was accustomed to. She did not look up from her book for more than a second. He grunted a reply, pouring himself a cup of wine, his mind already on a looming trade dispute with the southern provinces. He registered her formality as odd, but dismissed it. Perhaps she was tired. Perhaps she was simply letting him have the space he'd craved. A small, uncharitable part of him felt a flicker of relief. The morning was his own, his thoughts uncluttered by the need to perform pleasantries. It was peaceful. This new peace continued. That evening, after a grueling 10-hour session with the council, he returned to their chambers, his shoulders aching with tension. Usually, Sarah would be waiting in her favorite chair by the fire, a question in her eyes that was both an invitation and a comfort. "Tell me everything. Let me help you carry it." Tonight, the chair was empty. The fire was lit, the room was warm, but it was a sterile warmth, lacking a human center. He found her in her dressing room, humming softly as she put away her jewelry. "A difficult day?" she asked, her eyes meeting his in the mirror. "The usual," he said, waiting. He was braced for the follow-up, the gentle probing, the insistence that he unburden himself. "I see," she said, closing the velvet-lined box with a soft click. "I trust you handled it with your usual skill. Will you be wanting supper brought here, or will you join me in the hall?" The question was practical. Her tone was that of a courteous chatelaine, not a wife. There was no opening, no invitation to share. He felt a strange, jarring sense of being dismissed. "The hall is fine," he managed to say. The silence at dinner was a presence in itself. It sat between them, a third guest at the table. She spoke of household matters, a leak in the west wing roof, the new vintage of wine from the cellar. He spoke of the weather. They were two lords of neighboring manors discussing business, not a husband and a wife sharing a life. He found himself watching her, searching for a crack in the serene facade. There was none. She was beautiful, poised, a perfect high lady. And she was a complete stranger. Days turned into a week. The small, constant gestures of her affection vanished so completely it was as if they had never existed. She no longer sought his hand when they walked the colonnades. She no longer left a wildflower on his pillow. Her laughter still filled the castle halls, but it was reserved for her ladies-in-waiting, for the stable master's young son, for the head gardener. It never reached him. The light in her was not extinguished, it was simply redirected, shining everywhere but on him. He told himself it was what he wanted. He had his space. His dawns were his own, spent staring at maps and troop movements. His evenings were uninterrupted, allowing him to work late into the night. He had complained about her needing him, and now, she did not seem to need him at all. He had won. The peace he had craved was his. But the peace began to feel thin, stretched taut over a hollow abyss. The quiet in their chambers was no longer restful, it was empty. The efficiency of their interactions was no longer a relief, it was a constant, low-grade ache. He started to miss the scent of her hair when she leaned over his shoulder to look at a document. He missed the weight of her head on his chest as they read by the fire. He missed the sound of his own name on her lips, spoken not with the formality of my lord, but with the soft intimacy of Damon. He began to notice things he'd always taken for granted. The way the sunlight would catch in the silver threads of her embroidery, a craft she now pursued with singular focus. The specific tilt of her head when she listened to someone, a gesture of deep, unwavering attention that was no longer directed at him. He saw her across the great hall, sharing a joke with a visiting dignitary, her smile genuine and radiant, and a hot, unfamiliar pang of jealousy shot through him. That smile had once been his. He had owned 1,000 of them, a treasure he had been too foolish to count. He started to manufacture reasons to be near her, to breach the polite distance she so effortlessly maintained. He would seek her out in the library, holding a tome he had no intention of reading. "Sarah," he'd begin, his voice feeling rusty and unused for this purpose. "I was wondering if you had seen the histories of the First Dynasty." She would turn, her finger marking her place in her own book. "They are on the third shelf in the eastern alcove, my lord." Arranged chronologically, her eyes would meet his, clear and calm, offering no purchase. And then she would turn back to her page, the conversation concluded. The dismissal was so gentle, so perfectly courteous, it was more brutal than any angry word. It left him standing there, a fool in the echoing silence of the library. He tried another tactic, bringing her gifts. A bolt of silk from a far-off land, the color of a twilight sky. She accepted it with a graceful nod. "It is beautiful. Thank you, my lord. I will have the seamstress make good use of it." No delight, no shared fantasy of the gown it would become. Just a polite acknowledgement of a transaction. He brought her a necklace of star sapphires, stones that matched the deep blue of her eyes. He fastened it around her neck himself, his fingers brushing her skin. For a fleeting second, he felt a tremor pass through her, so faint he thought he might have imagined it. Her skin was warm, alive, but she held herself perfectly still, a statue allowing itself to be adorned. "You are too generous," she said, her voice a soft murmur. She met his gaze in the mirror, and for the first time in weeks, he saw something flicker behind the calm facade. It wasn't warmth. It was a deep, bottomless sorrow. The sight of it stole the air from his lungs. Then it was gone, shuttered away behind her perfect composure. She wore the necklace to the feast that night, a beautiful, cold ornament on a beautiful, cold woman. And he felt not pride, but a profound and growing despair. The first month bled into the second. The peace he had once celebrated had become a torment. The silence was a roaring void that consumed all the air in a room. Her absence, even when she was sitting right beside him, was a physical presence, a ghost at every meal, a cold weight in their bed. He found himself lingering in hallways he knew she would pass through, just to catch a glimpse of her, to receive the cool, polite nod that felt like a slap. He started watching her. Truly watching her, not as an extension of himself, but as a person separate from him. He saw her kindness to the staff, her patience with the squires, her sharp intelligence when she debated points of philosophy with the castle scholar. He saw a woman of immense depth and grace, a woman of quiet strength and profound feeling. And he was struck by a horrifying realization. He had been married to this extraordinary person for 5 years, and he had never truly seen her at all. He had only seen her in relation to himself as a comfort, a solace, a demand. He had seen her love as something he was entitled to, a resource to be drawn upon at his convenience. The memory of his words in the council chamber returned to him again and again, each time with a fresh wave of self-loathing. Exhausting. He had called her love exhausting. Now he knew what true exhaustion was. It was the constant, draining effort of pretending he was fine. It was the heavy, leaden feeling in his gut every time she called him my lord. It was lying awake at night, staring at the unmovable line of her back, knowing that just inches away was a universe he had been locked out of, and he had handed over the key himself. He began to lose his focus. During council meetings, his mind would drift. He'd stare at the heavy oak door and imagine her on the other side, not with a tray of tea, but just listening. What would she hear now? The ramblings of a distracted, hollowed-out man. Valerus made a joke at his expense one afternoon, a light-hearted jab about his somber mood. Damon didn't laugh. He just stared at the man, his eyes cold and flat, and the room fell silent. He had shared a laugh with this man at his wife's expense. The memory made him feel ill. He started to dream of her. Dreams where she was warm and laughing, her hand in his. He would wake with the ghost of her touch on his skin, the phantom echo of her voice in his ear, and the reality of the cold, silent room would crash down on him like a physical blow. The emptiness of his days was nothing compared to the desolation of his nights. One afternoon, seeking refuge from his own thoughts, he walked into the conservatory, a glass-paned marvel Sarah had designed and nurtured. It was her sanctuary. The air was warm and humid, thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming night jasmine. He found her there, on her knees, her hands deep in the soil as she repotted a fragile-looking orchid. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She looked content, at peace in a way he hadn't seen in months. He stood in the doorway, watching her. Here, surrounded by life she had cultivated, she was vibrant. The polite mask was gone, replaced by a genuine focus, a quiet joy. She was whole without him. The realization was both devastating and, strangely, illuminating. Her life did not revolve around him. It had once, perhaps, orbited him, but she had shifted her own gravitational pull. She had built a world for herself within the walls of his castle, a world where he was not the sun. She must have sensed his presence, because she looked up, her hands still in the dirt. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise. The calm, neutral expression she reserved for him flickered. For a moment, he saw the woman he had married, vulnerable and unguarded. Then the mask slid back into place. "My lord," she said, her voice even. "Is there something you require?" The formal address, here in her private sanctuary, was more jarring than ever. He shook his head, unable to form words. He wanted to cross the space between them. He wanted to kneel in the dirt beside her, to take her soil-stained hands in his, to wipe the smudge from her cheek. He wanted to say, "I require you. I require this. I was a fool." But the words were trapped behind a wall of his own making, a rampart of pride and shame. So he just stood there, a silent, pathetic statue in the doorway of her world. "If you will excuse me," she said softly, turning her attention back to the orchid, "this one requires a delicate hand." The dismissal was absolute. He was less important than a flower. And the worst part was, he knew she was right. He had been a careless hand, crushing the delicate thing he held. He turned and walked away, the scent of jasmine following him like a reproach. The peace had long since curdled. Now, it was becoming unbearable. The silence was no longer an absence of noise, it was a presence, a weight, a suffocating blanket he could not throw off. The third month of this cold, polite hell began, and Damon knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that he was breaking. The breaking was not a single, shattering event, but a slow, grinding erosion of his pride. It happened in pieces. It was the sight of her reading a letter from her sister, a small, secret smile gracing her lips, a smile he knew nothing about. It was hearing from a guard that she had spent an entire afternoon helping the cook's daughter with her letters, a quiet act of kindness he was no longer privy to. It was finding one of his old tunics, perfectly mended, folded at the foot of his side of the bed. It wasn't a gesture of affection. It was a duty performed. A task completed. The needlework was flawless, impersonal. It felt more like a final closing of an account than an act of care. Each instance was a small chisel blow against the stone of his arrogance. He had thought of her love as a boundless spring, something that would always be there for him to drink from, whether he was grateful or not. He had never considered that the spring could be capped. Or worse, that it could be diverted, its life-giving water flowing elsewhere, leaving him in a drought of his own making. The third month was a blur of desperation. His attempts to engage her became more frequent, more transparently needy. He would ask her opinion on trivial matters of state, treaties, and trade agreements he knew she cared little for. She would give him a thoughtful, intelligent answer, her mind sharp and clear, but her eyes would remain distant. She engaged with the problem, not with him. She was a brilliant advisor, a capable partner in governance. She was no longer his wife. He would try to reminisce, to conjure the ghost of their shared past. "Do you remember that summer at the Lake Palace? The night the fire drakes flew over the water?" "Yes, my lord," she would reply, her voice even. It was a remarkable celestial event. She stripped the memory of all its intimacy, rendering it a cold, historical fact. She didn't mention how she had hidden her face in his shoulder, half terrified, half awestruck. She didn't mention how they had stayed out until dawn, wrapped in a single cloak, their hands intertwined. She just acknowledged the event, as if reading it from a scroll. And with each attempt, a little more of him crumbled. He was a beggar, rattling a cup for a crumb of the affection he had once thrown away like scraps from a banquet table. The final, breaking moment came on a storm-lashed night at the end of the third month. The wind howled around the castle spires, and rain beat against the thick glass of their chamber windows in a furious, relentless rhythm. It was a night for shared warmth, for seeking comfort in another's arms. He sat by the fire, pretending to read a ledger, but his eyes kept straying to her. She was seated at her vanity, slowly brushing her long, dark hair. The firelight caught the strands, making them gleam like polished obsidian. Each stroke of the brush was slow, deliberate, meditative. He could hear the soft, rhythmic rasp of the bristles. The sound was deafening in the otherwise silent room. He watched her reflection in the mirror. Her face was serene, placid. She was a portrait of tranquility in the heart of the storm. He, on the other hand, felt like the storm was inside him, a maelstrom of regret and longing that was tearing him apart. He could not bear it for one more second. The polite fiction, the charade of civility, the vast, Arctic ocean between two people sitting in the same room, it was a torture more exquisite than any blade. He stood up. The ledger slid from his lap and hit the stone floor with a loud thud. She didn't flinch, didn't even pause in the rhythm of her brushing. Her eyes, in the mirror, watched him. He crossed the room and stood behind her. He could smell the clean, herbal scent of her soap, a scent that was so intimately familiar it made his chest ache. He looked at their reflections. A desperate, haunted man looming over a calm, unreachable woman. "Sarah," he began, and his voice was a raw, broken thing. She stopped brushing. Her hand, holding the silver-backed brush, rested in her lap. She simply waited, her gaze holding his in the mirror. The words came out in a torrent, a dam of shame and pride breaking all at once. "I know what you heard." He saw a flicker in her eyes, the barest acknowledgement. "That day. Outside the council chamber. I know you were there. I didn't see you, but I felt it later. I felt the world shift." He knelt. The act was instinctual, a surrender. The cold of the stone seeped through the fabric of his trousers. He was the High Lord of the Northern Reaches, a man who knelt for no one, and he was on his knees on the floor of his wife's bedchamber. I said things. Vile, thoughtless things. I was performing for them, for my council. Playing the part of the beleaguered husband for a cheap laugh. His voice cracked. I called you exhausting. I complained about your love. Like it was a burden. He finally looked away from the mirror, unable to bear the sight of his own wretched face. He stared at the floor, at the intricate weave of the rug. I was a fool. A cruel, blind fool. I had the sun in my hands, and I complained about the warmth. He took a ragged breath. And then you stopped. You stopped everything. And at first, I told myself it was peace. I told myself it was what I wanted. Space. Quiet. But it wasn't peace, Sarah. It was a void. It was the absence of everything that mattered. He looked up, meeting her eyes in the mirror again. They were filled with a sorrow so profound it was like looking into a deep, still lake. This silence, it's not quiet. It's the loudest thing I've ever heard. It's the sound of my own heart breaking, day after day. Waking up and the bed is cold. Walking into a room and you're not waiting. Speaking to you and hearing my lord from your lips, it's like a blade, every single time. Tears were tracking down his face now. He didn't bother to wipe them away. There was no pride left to protect. I miss you. Gods, Sarah, I miss you. You're right here, and I have never missed anyone so much in my entire, miserable life. I didn't know what I had. I had no idea what I had until you stopped giving it. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and bleeding. The only sounds were the howling of the wind outside and the ragged rasp of his own breathing. She was perfectly still, her expression unreadable. For a long, terrifying moment, he thought she would say nothing. That she would simply stand up and walk away, leaving him kneeling there in the ruins of his own making. Then, she turned on her bench. She didn't turn to face him fully, but angled herself so she could look down at him without the artifice of the mirror. Her eyes were not angry. They were not hateful. They were just weary. A deep, soul-level weariness that his foolishness had put there. "Thank you for your honesty, Damon," she said, and the sound of his name, spoken with such grave finality, was almost as painful as the formal title. But words, once they are spoken, cannot be unheard. They linger. They have echoes. She reached out, not to touch him, but to rest her hand on the vanity table, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood. You did not just say I was exhausting. You and your men, you laughed. You laughed at my affection. You took the most vulnerable, most tender part of me, the part one gave freely only to you, and you held it up for mockery. You broke my trust. Not just in you, but in what I thought we were building together. He wanted to argue, to defend, to explain, but he knew she was right. Her quiet, devastatingly calm assessment was the truest thing he had ever heard. I am glad you are no longer at peace, she continued, her voice soft but unyielding. Because what you called peace was the sound of my heart breaking. Now you are simply hearing the echo of it in your own. She stood up then, her movements fluid and graceful. She walked not to the bed, but to the small antechamber where she sometimes slept when she was reading late. I do not know if the thing you broke can be mended. And I will not allow you to hurt me like that again. She paused at the door, her back to him. I am not a prize to be won back with a grand gesture, Damon. I am not a kingdom to be conquered with a desperate siege. If there is a path back, it will not be short. And it is a path you will have to walk alone, for a very long time, before I will even consider taking a single step to meet you. She closed the door behind her. The click of the latch was as final as a nail in a coffin. He remained kneeling on the cold floor, the storm outside a pale imitation of the one that had just ripped through his soul, leaving nothing but wreckage behind. He had confessed. He had broken. And it had not been enough. The real work, the impossible work, had only just begun. Damon did not try to follow her. He understood, with a clarity born of utter devastation, that her words were not a negotiation. They were a statement of fact. He had built the wall between them brick by brick, and a single night of desperate tears would not knock it down. He would have to dismantle it, stone by painstaking stone, with no guarantee that he would ever reach the other side. The next morning, he rose before the sun. He went not to the strategy room, but to the kitchens. The staff, startled to see the High Lord in their domain at such an hour, scurried out of his way. He found the tin of Keshian tea, the one Sarah favored, and prepared it himself, his large, clumsy hands struggling with the delicate implements. He carried the cup, not on a silver tray, but in his own hands, to the door of her antechamber. He set it on the small table outside the door, a silent, humble offering. He did not knock. He did not wait for a response. He simply left it there and walked away. He did this every morning. Every single morning, he would rise in the pre-dawn dark, prepare the tea, and leave it for her. Most days, when he returned in the evening, the cup was still there, cold and untouched. Some days, it was gone, and he would allow himself a fragile, fleeting flicker of hope, though he knew it was likely a servant who had cleared it away. It did not matter. The act was not for her acknowledgement. It was for him. It was a daily penance, a small, tangible way to say the things he no longer had the right to voice. I remember. I am sorry. I am trying. He changed. The entire castle noticed. The sharp, impatient edge to his command softened. He started to listen more in his council meetings, truly listen, not just wait for his turn to speak. He sought out the opinions of those he had previously dismissed. He began to see the intricate web of lives and duties that made up his world, a world he had only ever viewed from the top. His attention to Sarah became a quiet, constant hum beneath the surface of his life. He did not pursue her. He did not press her for conversation or demand her attention. Instead, he simply observed. He learned her new routines, the paths she walked, the things that brought a spark of life to her carefully guarded expression. He learned that she spent her afternoons in the castle archives, painstakingly restoring ancient manuscripts. He arranged for better lighting to be installed in the dusty room and for a supply of the finest vellum to be delivered, all without a word to her. He learned that she had taken a young, orphaned girl under her wing, teaching her to read. He endowed a school for the castle's children, naming the archivist, a woman Sarah respected, as its headmistress. These were not gifts for her. They were acts of service to the world she was building, a world he had forced her to create in his absence. He was tending the edges of her garden, hoping that one day, she might let him past the gate. One afternoon, nearly a month after his confession, he found her in the stables, speaking softly to a nervous, high-strung mare. The horse had thrown its rider that morning and was skittish, its eyes wide with fear. The stable hands kept their distance, but Sarah stood close, murmuring to it, her hand stroking the powerful, trembling neck. Damon watched from the shadows of the stable entrance as she calmed the creature with nothing but her voice and a gentle, fearless patience. He saw in that moment how he should have behaved with her, with quiet, with patience, with a respect for the fear he himself had caused. He stepped forward. She heard him, but she did not turn. "She needs time," Sarah said, her voice soft, still directed at the horse. "You cannot command trust from a creature that you have frightened. You can only show it that you are not a threat, again and again, until it chooses to believe you." The words were for the horse. And they were for him. He knew it. He stood there for a long moment, accepting the lesson, the rebuke, the sliver of guidance. "I understand," he said, his voice equally quiet. And he turned and walked away, leaving her to her patient work. The seasons began to turn. The crisp air of autumn gave way to the first snows of winter. The cup of tea continued to appear outside her door each morning. The small, anonymous acts of support for her projects continued. He began to attend the evening poetry readings held by the Castle Scholar, not because he enjoyed poetry, but because he knew Sarah would be there. He would sit in the back, silent, and just listen to the cadence of the words, watching the way the firelight played on her face as she became lost in a story. It was a kind of shared intimacy, thin and fragile, but better than the nothingness that had preceded it. He started to talk to her, but not about them. He would seek her out in the library and ask her about the manuscript she was restoring. He listened, truly listened, as she explained the history of the text, her passion for the subject lighting her face from within. He found he was genuinely fascinated, not just by the topic, but by the intricate workings of her mind. He was discovering his wife, piece by piece, as if for the first time. The first thaw came on a bitterly cold evening in the heart of winter. A fever had swept through the lower town, and Sarah had been working tirelessly alongside the castle healers, brewing remedies and tending to the sick. She returned late, her face pale with exhaustion, her body slumping with fatigue. Damon was waiting in their main chamber. He had dismissed the servants and built up the fire himself. A hot meal was waiting on the table, and a bath had been drawn. She stopped in the doorway, her surprise evident. She looked from the meal to the fire, then to him. Her eyes were wary. "I thought you might be tired," he said, his voice hesitant. He did not approach her. He stayed by the fire, keeping a safe distance. "I can leave if you wish for privacy." She looked at him for a long, silent moment. He held his breath, expecting the polite dismissal, the courteous wall to go up. Instead, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse with weariness. I would like that." It was not forgiveness. It was not an invitation back into her heart. But it was not a rejection. It was a crack in the ice. He stayed, sitting in silence while she ate, refilling her goblet when it was empty. When she had finished, she stood to go to her bath. As she passed his chair, her hand brushed his shoulder. It was the lightest of touches, perhaps accidental, but it shot through him like lightning. It was the first time she had willingly touched him in over 6 months. He didn't move, didn't breathe, until he heard the soft click of the bathing chamber door. That night, for the first time in a very long time, he slept. Slowly, painstakingly, more moments like this began to accumulate. A shared look across a crowded room. A brief, hesitant conversation about a book they had both read. One morning, he found the teacup he left outside her door was not on the table, but on the floor, right beside the threshold. She had opened the door to take it. The true turning point came in the early spring. He was in a contentious meeting with his council. Lord Valerus, as usual, was advocating for an aggressive, militaristic response to a border dispute. It was the easy path, the path of brute force Damon himself would have once taken without a second thought. But he had learned from Sarah the strength of patience, the wisdom in understanding. He was about to overrule Valerus when the chamber door opened. Sarah stood there. She did not carry a tea tray. She held a scroll. All eyes turned to her. In the old days, she would never have interrupted a council meeting. "My apologies for the intrusion, my lords," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with an authority they had never heard from her before. She walked to the table and laid the scroll before Daemon. "I was in the archives. I found this. It is a treaty signed by your great-grandfather with the very clan you now propose to attack. It grants them the grazing rights to the disputed valley in perpetuity. To attack them would not be an act of strength, but a violation of our own sworn honor." The council was silent, stunned. Valerus's face was a mask of thunderous disbelief. Daemon looked from the ancient scroll to his wife's face. She met his gaze, her eyes clear and direct. She had not come to him in private. She had come here, to the very room where he had betrayed her, and in front of the very men who had laughed, she had offered him not just a solution, but a path to a better, more honorable kind of rule. She had saved him from his own worst instincts. He rose from his chair. "My lords," he said, his voice resonating with a power that came not from his title, but from a newfound certainty. "My wife is correct. We will not be forsworn. Lord Valerus, your counsel is noted, and it is rejected. We will send an envoy to reaffirm our ancient treaty and offer our friendship." He then turned to Sarah, his eyes holding hers. "Thank you, my lady. Your wisdom has, once again, proven to be this kingdom's greatest asset." It was a public declaration. It was an acknowledgement of her value, her intelligence, her integral role in his life and his reign. It was the opposite of the dismissive joke he had made in this same room. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, surprise, and something deeper, something warmer. She inclined her head, a gesture of respect, and turned to leave. That night, he found her on the balcony where they used to watch the dawn. The stars were brilliant in the cold, clear sky. He stood beside her, not touching, just sharing the space. "You saved me from making a terrible mistake today," he said into the quiet. "You saved yourself," she replied, her voice soft. "You chose to listen." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, a silence that was no longer a void, but a shared space. "I miss the dawns," he said, the admission quiet, vulnerable. She turned her head to look at him. In the starlight, he could see the conflict in her eyes, the cautious hope warring with the memory of pain. "The sun will rise in a few hours," she said. It was not a promise. But it was an opening. He stayed. He stood beside her as the sky slowly lightened, as the first pale shades of gray and pink bled across the horizon. Just as the sun's first brilliant ray crested the mountains, she reached out. Her fingers, hesitant at first, found his. She laced them through his, her grip tentative, fragile. He held her hand as if it were the most precious, delicate thing in the universe. He did not speak. He did not look at her. He just watched the sunrise, feeling the warmth of her skin against his, a silent, sacred promise. The healing was not instantaneous. It was a slow, deliberate journey. But they were finally walking the path together. He earned every smile, every shared laugh, every quiet moment of intimacy. He learned that her love was not a thing to be consumed, but a gift to be cherished, to be protected, to be honored. He brought her into his council, not as a silent observer, but as his most trusted advisor. Her wisdom tempered his strength, and together, they ruled with a grace and justice the kingdom had never known. He never called her needy or exhausting again. He never forgot the lesson of the silence. Years later, sitting with her on that same balcony, watching their children play in the gardens below, he would take her hand, the feel of it in his as familiar and as vital as his own heartbeat. He would look at her, at the woman who had broken him and then taught him how to be whole, and he knew, with a certainty that was the bedrock of his entire existence, that she was the only thing that made eternity worth living.